The stale air of the public shooting range hung heavy, thick with the metallic tang of spent gunpowder and the sharp, clean scent of gun oil. It was a cathedral of controlled violence, where echoes of concussive blasts served as hymns and the rhythmic cycling of bolts was a form of prayer. Into this space of loud precision walked a figure of profound quiet. His name was Silas, an old man whose 80-plus years had been etched into the deep canyons of his face by a sculptor named Time. His skin, the color of rich, dark soil, was a tapestry of a life lived under suns both foreign and domestic. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his frail frame a deceptive vessel for the bedrock of stillness that lay within. His hands, gnarled with arthritis and dappled with age spots, trembled slightly, a testament to the body's eventual surrender, yet they held the worn stock of his rifle with a familiarity that was less a grip and more an extension of his own being. The rifle was like him, old, seemingly obsolete, a relic from a bygone era. It was an M1 Garand, its walnut stock dark with the oil of 1,000 cleanings and the sweat of history. To the younger men at the range, with their modular, polymer-framed rifles adorned with lasers and holographic sights, it was a museum piece. To Silas, it was an old friend. He found his assigned lane, number 7, and began his ritual. Every movement was economical, steeped in a muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. He laid his rifle case on the narrow bench, the latches clicking open with a soft, satisfying snap. He placed the Garand on its stand, its weight settling with a solid thud. He methodically laid out his ammunition, 8-round N-block clips that seemed comically archaic next to the high-capacity magazines of his neighbors. He did not look at the others, yet he was aware of them, of their curious glances, of the subtle shift in the range's rhythm his presence caused. It was then that the harmony was broken by a discordant note of arrogant youth. His name was Kyle, the range safety officer, a man barely in his mid-20s who wore his red vest and authority like a king's ermine robe. He was a product of a generation that mistook confidence for competence and volume for validity. He strode down the line, his chest puffed out, correcting grips and stances with a condescending air. When his eyes fell on Silas and his antique rifle, a smirk crawled across his face. He saw not a man, but a caricature, a feeble old grandpa playing soldier. "Whoa there, Pops." Kyle's voice sliced through the air, sharp and laced with derision. "You sure you know how to handle that thing? We don't want you throwing your back out." A few of the younger shooters snickered. Silas continued his setup, his movements unhurried, as if Kyle were nothing more than a buzzing fly. He carefully donned his safety glasses and ear protectors, the silence descending like a welcome shroud. This quiet defiance, this utter lack of reaction, only served to fuel Kyle's insecurity. He stepped closer, invading Silas's personal space. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man. This isn't a VFW hall. This is a live-fire range. That piece of firewood you got there probably hasn't been fired since before I was born. I need to see you clear it before you even think about loading it." Silas finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Kyle's. There was no anger in them, no fear, only a deep, placid calm that was more unnerving than any retort. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "The weapon is clear," he said, each word chosen and placed with care. "The chamber is empty. The action is open." Kyle scoffed, grabbing the rifle from its stand with a shocking lack of respect. He cycled the bolt noisily, peering into the chamber with an exaggerated performance of diligence. "Yeah, well, I'm the RSO. I'll be the judge of that." He slammed the bolt shut and shoved the rifle back toward Silas. "Just try not to hurt yourself. And make sure you actually hit the paper. My 5-year-old nephew has a better grouping than most of you old-timers." The humiliation was public, a deliberate act of theater designed to establish dominance. The other shooters shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact, others watching with morbid curiosity. Silas simply took his rifle, his trembling hands caressing the stock, and turned back to the lane, his silence an unbreachable fortress against the boy's petty aggressions. He was an island of tranquility in a sea of Kyle's making, a quiet hero about to face his first, but not his last, trial of the day. The air thickened with unspoken tension. Kyle stood back, arms crossed, a smug sentinel waiting for the inevitable failure that would validate his prejudice. He had made his point, and now the entire firing line was his audience, waiting for the punchline to his cruel joke. Silas, seemingly oblivious, was a study in concentration. He retrieved one of the en-bloc clips, the brass cartridges gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His fingers, though trembling, moved with an unerring certainty, guiding the clip into the rifle's open breech. With a practiced motion of his thumb, he pressed it down until it clicked into place. The bolt snapped forward with a deafening, metallic clang, a sound of lethal purpose that momentarily silenced the range. It was a sound of history, a mechanical growl that had echoed across the beaches of Normandy and the frozen hills of Korea. It was a sound that Kyle, with his plastic and aluminum firearms, had only ever heard in movies. For a moment, the boy's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of something else, perhaps the primal recognition of a tool designed for a singular, deadly purpose. Silas settled into his stance. It was not the aggressive, forward-leaning posture favored by modern tactical shooters. It was an older stance, rooted and solid, as if he were growing directly from the concrete floor. He raised the heavy Garand to his shoulder, the steel butt plate settling into a groove worn there by decades of practice. He leaned into the weapon, becoming one with the wood and steel, his breathing slowing to a barely perceptible rhythm. In, hold out. The world narrowed, the noisy range fading into a distant hum. His focus condensed, lasering in on the paper target 50 yards away, a black circle on a beige canvas. But he wasn't looking at the bullseye. His gaze was fixed slightly above it, on the simple metal clip that held the paper to the wooden backstop. Kyle's impatience grew. "Any day now, Grandpa," he jeered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We don't have all afternoon." Silas did not react. He was in the zone, a sacred space between breaths where time itself seemed to stretch and thin. He took a final, slow breath, letting half of it out, and his body became utterly still. The tremor in his hands vanished, subsumed by a will of iron. His finger curled around the trigger, taking up the slack. For a heartbeat, there was perfect silence, a pocket of absolute calm in the storm of the range. Then, the Garand roared. It was not the sharp crack of the smaller caliber rifles around it. It was a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of everyone present. A tongue of flame licked from the muzzle, and the heavy bolt cycled with violent precision, ejecting the spent casing with a sharp ping that was almost musical. The single shot echoed, and then silence returned, heavier than before. Everyone stared downrange, waiting to see the result. From their vantage point, nothing looked different. The paper target was still there, seemingly untouched. Kyle's smirk returned, wider and more triumphant than ever. This was it. The perfect, public failure. "Let's go see that masterpiece," he said, pressing the button to retrieve the target carrier. The electric motor whirred as the target assembly traveled along its cable, drawing closer and closer. Kyle unclipped it with a flourish and held it up for all to see. He laughed, a loud, braying sound that filled the room. "Well, look at that. A complete miss. Didn't even touch the paper. I told you, Pops, you shouldn't be handling this stuff." He waved the target around like a trophy. It was a clean sheet. Not a single hole marred its surface. The mockery was absolute. The catalyst for his complete vindication was now an object of absolute shame. Whispers turned into open chuckles. Silas was now not just an old man. He was an incompetent old man, a danger to himself and others, a joke. He calmly placed his rifle back on the stand and began to remove his ear protectors, his expression unreadable. He did not look at the pristine target, the symbol of his supposed failure. He already knew what was there and what wasn't. The acrid smell of the single, perfectly combusted charge of gunpowder was a key, unlocking a door in Silas's mind that had been closed for over 60 years. As Kyle's mocking laughter echoed in the present, its sound warped and faded, replaced by the incessant, drumming rain of a monsoon in the jungles of Vietnam. The fluorescent lights of the range dissolved into the suffocating green canopy, a world of perpetual twilight and damp, cloying heat. He was no longer 80, but a wiry 20-year-old sergeant, his muscles coiled like springs, his face a mask of mud and fierce concentration. The weight in his hands was not the familiar Garand of his father's war, but a newer, darker rifle, the M14, though its soul was much the same. His platoon was pinned down, trapped in a waterlogged bomb crater. The air was alive with the hornet buzz of enemy fire, rounds cracking overhead and chewing up the muddy earth around them. Their radio was dead, their radio man hit, and their only hope was a claymore mine they had set up on a trail flanking the enemy position. But the clacker, the detonator, was useless. The command wire had been severed by a stray round. 10 yards away, another wire, the one leading from the backup detonator on their command post, had been snagged on a broken tree limb during a frantic retreat, pulling the detonator itself from the sergeant's belt and leaving it dangling precariously over a deep ravine, held only by the thin, copper filament of the wire itself. To get to it was suicide. To leave it was to be overrun. The lieutenant, a boy fresh from West Point with terrified eyes, looked at Silas. "Freeman," he had whispered, his voice cracking. "Can you do it?" He wasn't asking if Silas could make the run. He was asking something impossible. He was asking if Silas could shoot the wire. Not the detonator, which would set off the mine and likely kill them with shrapnel, but the single, pencil-lead thin wire connecting it to the command post, dropping the device into the hands of a young private hiding in the ravine below. It was a shot that belonged in mythology, not on a battlefield. It was a 1 in a million chance, with the lives of 30 men hanging in the balance. Silas remembered the feeling, the world narrowing just as it had moments ago. The cacophony of the firefight faded to a dull roar. The faces of his brothers in arms, young men caked in mud and fear, became a blur. All that existed was his front sight post, the driving rain, and that impossibly small target. He controlled his breathing, the same measured rhythm. In, hold, out. He felt the familiar pressure in his chest, the weight of command, the icy calm that always descended in moments of supreme crisis. He remembered the tremor in his hands, not from age, but from adrenaline and exhaustion, and the force of will required to make them still. He aligned his sights, holding not on the wire, but a hair's breadth above it, accounting for the drop, the wind, the rain. He squeezed the trigger. The M14 had roared, a sound swallowed by the jungle and the firefight. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the detonator, freed from its perch, swung down on its remaining wire and into the waiting hands of the private below. A second later, the jungle to their left erupted in a deafening explosion as the claymore was triggered, scything down the flanking enemy force and breaking the ambush. That one shot had saved them all. The memory faded, the vibrant, terrifying green of the jungle receding, replaced by the dull gray concrete of the shooting range. Kyle was still talking, but his voice was now just a meaningless drone. The smell of cordite was the same. The feeling of the stock against his shoulder was the same. The impossible shot, a secret kept for a lifetime, was the same. He had not missed the target. He had simply aimed for a different one. Silas remained still, his spirit 60 years and half a world away, his calm exterior a perfect mask for the vivid ghosts dancing behind his eyes. His stoicism was profound, an ancient tree that no longer swayed in the wind. To Kyle and the others, it was the vacant stillness of senility, the shameful paralysis of a man caught in a moment of utter failure. The scene was frozen in a tableau of humiliation, the arrogant youth triumphant, the silent old man defeated, the crowd of onlookers a mixture of pity and contempt. But not everyone in the crowd was blind. Standing near the back, by the vending machines, was a man named Mark Peterson. Mark was in his late 50s, a retired Marine colonel now working as a civilian consultant. He wasn't there to shoot. He was waiting for his son's lesson to finish. He had seen the whole exchange, his jaw tightening with each of Kyle's condescending remarks. He recognized the rifle first. The M1 Garand was the ceremonial rifle of the Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon, a weapon he knew intimately. He recognized the stance, the breathing, the preternatural calm before the shot. It was the mark of a true rifleman, not some fumbling amateur. When the target came back clean, Mark didn't see a miss. He felt a prickle of cognitive dissonance. The man who held that rifle, who fired that shot, did not miss. It was a logical impossibility. His eyes narrowed, and he looked past the target at the wooden frame of the carrier. He couldn't see anything from this distance, but a seed of suspicion had been planted. He watched Kyle's victory lap, the way he preened and mocked the old, silent black man, and a cold, familiar anger began to build in his gut. It was the same anger he'd felt seeing a young lieutenant bully a private, the same disgust at the abuse of petty authority. He saw the quiet dignity with which Silas absorbed the abuse, and it wasn't the posture of shame. It was the posture of patience. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Mark made a decision. He pulled out his smartphone, his fingers tapping on the screen with military efficiency. He scrolled through his contacts, a list that read like a who's who of the Department of Defense. He bypassed colonels and majors, his thumb flying past names that would make most service members stand at attention. He stopped on a name at the very top, General Thompson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was an audacious, insane leap of protocol, a call a retired colonel should never make. But this was different. This was a matter of honor. He pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear. "Sentinel, this is Fortress," a crisp voice answered, the general's aide. "Stand by for General Thompson." A moment later, a voice that could command armies and council presidents came on the line. "Mark? What is it?" This had better be good. Mark kept his voice low, turning away from the spectacle. "General, sorry to jump the chain, sir. I'm at the civilian range on Elm Street. There's an old-timer here, an elderly black gentleman. He's shooting an M1 Garand." He paused. "Sir, I think it's him. I think it's Sergeant Major Freeman." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, charged with meaning. "Are you sure?" General Thompson's voice had lost its casual edge, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. "I am, sir. He fits the description from the archives. And the RSO here, a kid, is publicly humiliating him. Laughed him off the line for a missed shot. Sir, it's a disgrace. They don't know who he is." Another pause. Mark could almost hear the gears turning, the immense weight of the institution shifting. "Where are you?" the general asked, his voice now cold steel. "Elm Street Public Range," Mark repeated. "Stay there. Do not engage. Do not intervene. I'm sending a car. I'm in it." The line went dead. Mark lowered his phone, a shiver running down his spine despite the stuffy heat of the range. He had just thrown a grenade into the situation. He looked over at Silas, who was now being told by Kyle to pack up his junk and leave before he hurt someone. The cavalry was coming. The transition was so swift it was almost cinematic. The mundane, insulated world of the shooting range, with its predictable rhythms and petty dramas, was about to be breached by an outside force of overwhelming authority. It began not with a bang, but with a sound that did not belong. Faintly at first, then rapidly growing louder, came the insistent, chopping beat of helicopter blades. A few people glanced towards the windows, confused. The sound grew to a deafening roar, seemingly right on top of them, shaking the building's foundations and rattling the light fixtures. Dust motes danced in the air. The helicopter noise was immediately joined by the squeal of tires from the parking lot. Through the large plate glass window at the front of the building, two imposing black Chevrolet Suburbans, the kind favored by federal agents and high-level dignitaries, swerved into the lot at high speed, executing a perfect pincer movement to block the entrance and exit. They came to a halt with a precision that bespoke countless hours of training. Their tinted windows gave them a menacing, inscrutable appearance. The doors of both vehicles flew open in unison, and 6 men emerged. They were not soldiers in uniform, but they might as well have been. Dressed in dark, impeccably tailored suits with earpieces discreetly fitted, they moved with the fluid, predatory grace of Secret Service agents. Their eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned everything, assessing threats, establishing a perimeter. They moved to secure the entrance of the range, their very presence a silent, undeniable declaration that this was no longer a public space. Kyle, who had been in the middle of telling Silas to get his fossil out of my range, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth agape. His authority, which 5 minutes ago had seemed absolute, instantly evaporated, revealed as the flimsy, pathetic thing it was. He stared, bewildered, as the men in suits took up positions by the door, one of them speaking quietly into his wrist. The shooters in the other lanes had all stopped, their weapons lowered, an instinctive reaction to a greater power. The air crackled with confusion and a nascent sense of fear. Then, the front door opened, held by one of the agents. Into the room strode a figure who seemed to suck all the air and light towards him. He was a man in his late 60s, tall and ramrod straight, wearing the immaculate Class A uniform of a four-star general of the United States Army. His chest was a billboard of military achievement, rows of colorful ribbons testifying to a lifetime of service and combat. At the very top, around his neck on a light blue ribbon, hung the simple, five-pointed star of the Medal of Honor. This was General James Iron Jaw Thompson, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the most powerful military men on the planet. His face was granite, his eyes chips of ice, and they swept the room with an expression of profound, controlled fury. The entire building fell into a tomb-like silence, broken only by the hum of the ventilation system. The sudden, dramatic, and utterly inexplicable arrival of this military demigod was a shock to the system, a tear in the fabric of reality. Kyle, looking from the general to his suited entourage to the still-chopping helicopter, was completely out of his depth, a minnow facing a leviathan. He had been the king of his tiny, concrete castle, and now an emperor had just breached its walls. General Thompson's boots struck the concrete floor with heavy, rhythmic footfalls, each step an indictment. The sound was unnaturally loud in the cavernous silence. His gaze swept past the other shooters, past the bewildered staff at the counter, and past Mark, to whom he gave the barest, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. His eyes locked onto the two figures at the center of the drama, the arrogant, red-vested youth and the frail, elderly black man standing with a quiet, unshakable dignity. Kyle, his mind struggling to process the sheer surreality of the situation, finally found his voice, a squeak that was a pathetic shadow of his earlier bravado. He took a half-step forward, puffing up his chest in a last, desperate attempt to assert the authority he no longer possessed. "Sir," he began, his voice cracking, "this is a civilian facility. You can't just—" He was cut off not by a word, but by a look. The general turned his head slowly, and his icy gaze fell upon Kyle. It was a look of such pure, unadulterated contempt that Kyle physically recoiled, his words dying in his throat. The general did not have to speak. His presence communicated everything. "You are nothing. You are less than the dirt on my boots. Do not presume to address me." He then turned his back on Kyle completely, the dismissal so absolute it was more insulting than any curse. He continued his measured walk until he stood directly in front of Silas. The contrast was stark. The general, a pillar of institutional power, resplendent in his decorated uniform, and Silas, a stooped, 80-year-old man in a worn flannel shirt and faded jeans. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. The general's granite expression softened, the ice in his eyes melting away, replaced by a look of profound, almost reverent respect. Then, in a movement so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, General Thompson brought his right hand up to his brow, his body snapping to the rigid, perfect posture of a soldier reporting to a superior. It was the salute of a lifetime, a gesture imbued with the full weight of the United States military and a deep, personal history. "Sergeant Major Silas Freeman," the general's voice boomed, a parade ground command that resonated off the walls. "General James Thompson reporting as ordered, sir. It is an honor to stand in your presence again." The word "sir," delivered from a four-star general to an old man in civilian clothes, was a thunderclap. It shattered every assumption in the room. Kyle's face went white, the blood draining from it, as if a plug had been pulled. The other shooters exchanged glances of stunned disbelief. Mark Peterson allowed himself a small, grim smile. The reversal had begun. Silas looked at the general, a flicker of recognition in his deep-set eyes. He gave a slow, slight nod. "At ease, Jimmy," he said, his voice the same quiet rumble. The use of the familiar nickname was another shockwave, cementing the incredible truth of the situation. This was not a random encounter. These men, the pinnacle of military power and the forgotten relic, shared a history. The great wheel of justice had begun to turn, and its weight was about to come crashing down. General Thompson held his salute for a second longer, a mark of ultimate respect, before dropping his hand to his side. He maintained his posture of parade rest, a subordinate in the presence of a legend. "Sir," he said, his voice now softer but still carrying to every corner of the room, "I was informed there was a situation here requiring my immediate attention. A situation involving disrespect to a national hero." His eyes flickered towards Kyle, a silent promise of the storm to come. He then turned his attention back to Silas and the target of the recent mockery. "They say you missed your shot, Sergeant Major." It wasn't a question, it was a prompt, an invitation to reveal the truth. Silas remained silent, letting the events unfold as they would. The general nodded, understanding. "May I?" he asked, gesturing towards the lane. He walked over to the bench and retrieved the paper target that Kyle had so proudly displayed. He held it up for everyone to see its clean, unblemished surface. "This is what our young range officer here calls a miss," the general stated, his voice dripping with irony. He sees an empty piece of paper and laughs. He sees a man of 80 years and scoffs. He sees history standing before him and is blind, because he has been trained to look, but not to see. He then did something no one expected. He walked past the firing line, through the gate, and all the way downrange to the target carrier at the 50-yard mark. His entourage of suited men tensed, their hands twitching, but did not stop him. He unclipped the entire wooden frame from its moorings and carried it back with him. He placed it on the bench for all to inspect. "Look closer," he commanded, his voice hardening. His finger pointed not at the paper, but at the very top of the wooden frame. A simple, thin metal wire ran through two eyelets, and from this wire, a small metal clip was suspended to hold the target in place. Or, rather, where it was suspended, the wire was no longer intact. It had been perfectly, miraculously severed, a clean break in the metal. The two ends hung down, glistening under the lights. The bullet hadn't missed. The bullet had performed surgery. The general turned his gaze to the stunned crowd. In 1968, in the A Shao Valley, he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a historian. A platoon from the 101st Airborne was cut off and surrounded. Their communications were down, their command was dead, and an enemy machine gun nest had them zeroed in. Their only hope was a claymore mine, but the detonator had been lost, snagged on a tripwire 30 yards away in the open. To go for it was death. To stay was death. He paused, letting the weight of the story settle. A young sergeant named Silas Freeman, armed with an M14, was asked to do the impossible. He was asked to shoot the wire. A single, impossibly thin strand of copper. In the middle of a firefight, in the pouring rain, he took one breath and fired one shot. The general looked directly at Silas, his eyes filled with awe. That one shot cut the wire, saved 30 men, and turned the tide of the entire engagement. That shot became the stuff of legend. They called him the surgeon, a man who could use a rifle like a scalpel, a shot that earned him the Medal of Honor he was too humble to ever wear. He then pointed back at the severed wire on the target frame. "He didn't miss the target, you blind, arrogant child," he snarled, his eyes finally locking onto Kyle's. "He hit a target you weren't even capable of seeing." The general's full attention now coalesced upon Kyle, and the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The booming, declamatory voice he had used for his monologue vanished, replaced by a low, menacing tone that was far more terrifying. It was a voice honed in places of extreme danger, a voice that could make hardened soldiers flinch. "You," the general began, taking a deliberate step toward the boy, who now seemed to be shrinking into his red vest. "You stand here in your little kingdom of concrete and gunpowder, and you think this vest gives you power. You think your youth gives you superiority. You looked at this man, a man whose boots you are not worthy to lick, and you saw nothing but a target for your own pathetic insecurities." Kyle began to stammer. "I didn't know. I was just—" The general cut him off with a sharp, slicing gesture of his hand. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice a venomous whisper. "That is your damnation. It is your job to know. In my world, ignorance is not an excuse. It is a fatal flaw. You are in a place of weapons and responsibility. You are supposed to be an arbiter of safety and respect. Instead, you are a clown. A dangerous, disrespectful clown." He stepped closer still, until he was directly in Kyle's face. Kyle, who was taller than the general, seemed to shrink, cowering before the sheer force of the man's will. "You mocked his age. This man's 80 years contain more honor, more courage, and more sacrifice than you will ever comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes. The tremors in his hands that you found so amusing? They are the legacy of holding his dying friends, of enduring hardships that would shatter a boy like you into dust." The general's voice dropped even further, becoming a barely audible, chilling hiss. And you dared to touch his rifle. You put your profane hands on a consecrated object. That M1 Garand was gifted to Sergeant Major Freeman by President Johnson himself. It has seen more history than your entire family tree. You handled a holy relic like it was a piece of trash. The verbal evisceration was relentless, each word a perfectly aimed blow. So here is what is going to happen, the general continued, his voice regaining a cold, formal edge. As of this second, your employment here is terminated. Your license as a range safety officer is revoked. I am going to place a call to the head of the state police, and I am going to have your name and file flagged. You will never again work in a position of authority, not in law enforcement, not in security, not even as a goddamn mall cop. You will find it very difficult to even purchase a firearm for the rest of your miserable life. You have proven yourself to have the character of a maggot, and you will be treated as such. Are we clear? Kyle could only nod, tears welling in his eyes, his face a mask of utter devastation. The general stared at him for a moment longer, a predator ensuring its prey was neutralized. Get out of my sight, he commanded. Take off that vest. You are no longer worthy to wear it. The rebuke was complete, a systematic and public dismantling of a man's pride, career, and future. As Kyle stood trembling, stripped bare of his arrogance and authority, a broken figure in the center of the room, Silas finally moved. He took a slow step forward, placing a gentle, trembling hand on the general's rigid arm. The general instantly softened, turning to face the old sergeant major with a look of questioning respect. That's enough, Jimmy, Silas said, his voice a low, raspy bomb in the charged atmosphere. The lesson has been taught. All eyes turned to him. After enduring so much public humiliation, after being so thoroughly vindicated, everyone expected righteous anger, or at the very least, a cold satisfaction. Instead, they saw something entirely different in his eyes as he looked at the weeping young man. They saw pity. He's just a boy, Silas continued, his voice calm and even, full of noise and vinegar. Pride is a heavy coat on a weak frame. It's hard to carry when you're young. He'll learn. This act of grace was perhaps more stunning than the impossible shot itself. To have the power of a four-star general at his back, to have his tormentor utterly vanquished, and to then ask for mercy on his behalf. It was a display of character so profound that it left the entire room speechless. It was the quiet strength of a man who had faced true evil and had no time for petty vengeance. It was the ultimate victory, one that required no further punishment of the defeated. General Thompson looked from Silas to Kyle and back again. He held Silas's gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between two old soldiers. Finally, the general nodded, the hard lines of his face relaxing into something resembling a weary smile. As you wish, Sergeant Major, he said, acquiescing to the higher authority in the room, the authority of moral grace. He gestured to two of his agents. Escort this young man out. Get his details. My office will handle the administrative follow-up. The agents moved forward, flanking Kyle, who seemed to be in a state of shock. They gently took the red vest from his nerveless fingers and led him towards the exit, not as a prisoner, but as a broken child being removed from the scene of an accident. The fallout was immediate. As Kyle was led away, the other shooters began to stir, a collective sense of shame washing over them. They had been bystanders. They had watched the injustice unfold. Some had even snickered along, and they had done nothing. They now looked at Silas with a newfound awe, tinged with the bitter taste of their own inaction. The atmosphere of the range had been irrevocably changed. It was no longer just a place to shoot guns. It had become a classroom, a courtroom, and a church, all in the space of an hour. The quiet hero had won his battle not with a bullet, but with a lifetime of character that shone brightest when he chose to forgive. 1 week later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the green expanse of a city park. Silas sat on his usual bench, a worn paperback in his lap, watching children play on a nearby swing set. He was a portrait of tranquility, a man at peace with the world and his place in it. A hesitant figure approached, shuffling his feet, casting a nervous shadow over the old man. It was Kyle. He looked different. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a stooped, humbled posture. He wore simple clothes, and his eyes were red-rimmed, as if he hadn't slept much. He stood before the bench for a full minute before finding the courage to speak. Sir, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sergeant Major Freeman? Silas looked up slowly from his book, his eyes showing no surprise. He simply waited. Kyle swallowed hard, his hands twisting the hem of his shirt. I I wanted to apologize, he stammered, the words coming out in a rush. What I did, what I said to you, there's no excuse. I was arrogant and stupid and disrespectful. I saw your age, and I saw your race, and I judged you. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. I'm so sorry. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He had clearly lost his job and faced a bleak future, but the punishment from the general was nothing compared to the weight of his own shame. Silas listened to the entire confession without interruption, his expression patient and calm. When Kyle finished, the silence stretched on, thick with the young man's desperate hope for absolution. Finally, Silas closed his book, marking his page with a finger. He patted the empty space on the bench beside him. Sit down, son. Kyle hesitated, then sank onto the bench, looking at his feet. You know, Silas began, his voice a low rumble. A man's real strength isn't measured by the power he has over others. It's measured by the respect he shows when he has all the power. You thought that vest made you strong. It just made your weakness louder. He looked over at the young man, his gaze direct but not unkind. I accept your apology, Kyle. The words were simple, but for Kyle, they were a lifeline. He looked up, his eyes wide with gratitude. But accepting it is the easy part, Silas continued. Living it is harder. You have to carry this lesson with you. Let it make you better. Let it make you kinder. He paused, looking out at the children laughing. Respect isn't in the uniform you wear, son, or the title on your door. It's in the way you treat the person who's just there to clean it. It's in how you treat the quiet ones, the old ones, the ones everyone else overlooks. That's where you find a person's true measure. The two sat in silence for a while longer, the old soldier and the humbled youth, a bridge of understanding built between them. The wound was not forgotten, but it was cleansed, and the process of healing had begun. If you were moved by the story of Silas Freeman, a quiet hero who taught a powerful lesson without raising his voice, please share this story. If you believe that the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable and honors its most valiant, take a moment to reflect on the quiet heroes in your own life. Our veterans and our elders carry stories and wisdom we can only imagine. They ask for nothing, but they deserve everything, starting with our respect.